Hey, look, shiny castle. Let's go pillage it. Hello and welcome to another episode of Mount&Blade Ultimate Guide. Sorry to my few subscribers, I haven't really been active recently, but today I'm going to talk about one-handed weapons, and I'm going to talk to you about each type of one-handed weapon, how they work, whether or not they function the best on siege, foot, or a horse combat, etc. And you'll understand what kind of weapon to use for what situation. The first thing we're going to talk about is swords, and generally swords are a kind of weapon that basically I would categorize in the weapon reach about 100 weapon reach, decent damage, decent weapon speed. Why I categorize these swords in this section? Well, generally these swords offer versatility. They don't have the most damage, they don't have the longest reach, they don't have the fastest speed, but they offer versatility. The versatility of the sword lets you be able to use it in horse combat quite efficiently. The reach isn't as desired, but it still has decent reach, and you can still hit quite a few people with it. So on horse combat, the sword is useful, but it's also useful in on foot combat. When you fight on foot, you kind of need that faster weapon speed, or that lower range actually if you fight in a group of cluster people. Like in a siege, when you fight in a siege, you have to be able to fight in a cluster of people, and the short length on the sword lets you do that, lets you swing your sword without having it hit up against a wall or some random guy's shield like 3 meters away. So that's the versatility provided by the sword makes it a good weapon. If you can switch weapons in between battles, I suggest you don't use the sword, but if you need versatility, that's the go-to weapon for you. The next weapon I'm going to talk about is I call it the shock troop infantry weapon. And I call them the shock troop infantry weapon because they're heavy damage, low range, they have very low range, and okay amount of speed. Why I think this is good, these weapons usually fall very badly when you use horse combat. As you can see here, I can barely hit any of my swings. But these weapons, which are usually axes, maces, military picks, they do a lot of damage, and that's what counts. Because they're infantry weapon, when you're in a siege or when you're in an infantry battle, they're very easy to swing around. Even when there's a lot of people around, you can easily swing it, hit a guy beside you, hit a guy in front of you. Get a couple of shots in while they're banging their sword on your friend's shield, or they're not even getting any hits in, because your weapon is shorter than them, and that lets you swing it around in a tight space. And sometimes in siege warfare, that's that's one of the best things you can do. So if your character has a good proficiency on that one-handed weapon, and if your character, if you can switch weapons in between battles and you're okay with that, it's very good to be able to carry like a winged mace around like I'm using here, to use them in actual foot combat when you use a siege or whatever. The next weapon I'm going to talk about is what I call a Calvary Blade. Calvary Blades are usually in the form of bastard swords if you play the native mod, but there's a lot more Calvary Blades in other mods. Right now I'm using what's called a Rune Bastard Sword in Prophecy of Pendor. And what Calvary Blades are, usually they're long, very long blades, usually about 120 or more reach. Usually they're slower, but they also do a lot of damage. And these Calvary Blades actually benefit a lot in horse combat because they're very long. They can easily mow down your opponent without even them touching you. And they also do a lot of damage with the increased speed of your horse that usually amounts to 1 or 2 hit kills, which is always good. However, these weapons usually have slower swing speed. This usually isn't a bad thing because on a horse, your swing speed doesn't really matter. However, when you're actually on foot, it kind of suffers. So, on foot, the cavalry sword, if you're playing on foot one-on-one combat, it's perfectly fine. Because even though there's no speed, it gives you the range of the damage, which is always useful in a one-on-one combat. But as you see here, I'm fighting this guy, and sometimes it's kind of hard for me to get a hit in. I got kind of lucky there because I blocked him with my sword, but usually it's harder to get your hit in because these cavalry swords are usually slower than the other swords. In sieges, these swords just completely fall. They're way too long. You're trying to swing it, you can randomly hit somebody's shield, you randomly hit a guy beside you, you can't hit whoever's in front of you, and eventually you don't do enough damage and you die. So I don't recommend using a cavalry sword in any type of foot combat. If your horse got killed, sure, that's fine. But eventually you'll have to pull out your winged mace or whatever. The type of one-handed weapons is usually dictated by your type of playstyle, whether you're a footman or an archer or a horseman. But generally, it's a good idea to have an arsenal of weapons in your inventory just so you can switch out mid-battle. Whatever the case, I hope you enjoyed this guide, and I'll see you next time.